Hello and welcome to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders, the podcast show where I interview the most inspirational and thought-provoking leaders of today and unearth their unique stories of diversity and inclusion to help inspire, educate and motivate others to make the world a better place. Today, I'm absolutely honoured to be joined by the fabulous Ewan Pearson. Ewan is the Managing Director of Grant Pearson Brown Consulting Limited and also Exec Chairman for Cubic. Ewan's got a really interesting background, which is why I was so delighted to have him on the show today. Now, initially he was a medical doctor. He briefly actually worked as a school teacher, then an investment banker in corporate finance, and then turned into a stockbroker. Since 1991, he's been a professional advisor in the field of spoken and written communications, advising top management on their key events such as IPOs, trade sales, results presentations and key conferences and new business pitches. He worked on the London 2012 bid in 2005 and more recently the Treasury Select Committee inquiry into private equity in July 2007. He's also worked on a successful bid to host the World Athletic Championships in London. Most of what he does these days is help clients win business, win pitches or raise funds to manage. In his spare time, he is the executive chair of Cambridge University Boat Club, a trustee of JCBC Trust and a chair of the Canterbury Pilgrims Boat Club. I was very lucky to actually have first-hand experience of Ewan, watching him talk to a group of CEOs at the School of CEOs 2-day course, where he taught us all how to be more articulate and how to present ourselves in the manner in which we should be doing so. Welcome to the show today, Ewan.
Thank you very much, Leila. It's great to be with you.
And thank you very much for joining us. Now, just to get all of our listeners up to speed with everything that you've been doing, of course, I was fortunate to see you in action, as it were, with your very articulate self, which was wonderful because you were using words I hadn't heard of before. And I thought, oh my goodness, I need to be reading more English literature here. But it would be great for you just to share with all of our listeners a little bit more about some of the key projects you're doing at the moment before we kind of launch into today's podcast session and learn more about how we can present and speak better and touch on some of those elements around diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, very happy to share generally what we're doing. I can't go into details because most of what I do is confidential, ditto my colleagues. But in general terms, it's AGM season at the moment. Here we are in May, and we're coming towards the end of a long list of clients who we've helped with their annual general meetings for investors, where we're coaching people to be effective at communicating key messages in those sorts of settings to typically investors and analysts. Part of those AGMs that we do are for private equity businesses, where we have quite a strong hold. And I've been to Boston to do an AGM for a business there, and I've done a couple here in London in the last couple of weeks. All of them involve acts of communication to be effective and to, in many cases, persuade investors that what they've invested in is a good thing to do. And so plenty of time doing that. In addition to that, quite differently, we've been coaching a number of individuals to become more effective communicators. This could be men and women. In fact, there's quite a lot of women in that set of people working with at the moment, coaching them one-to-one, a couple of hours at a time, then with a break, and then another couple of hours, and another break, and so on. Again, with the same general purpose, it's to be more effective as a communicator in whatever setting they're in. But it's not related to a specific event. It's coaching people to become more effective. Some of that is involved working with women who are trying to get promoted, and it's a subject I would like to come back to a little later on. But there you are. There's a quick summary.
Fantastic. So you are an expert in the art of persuasion then, Ewan?
Yeah, I'm a student, certainly, of the subject of persuasion. Been teaching people about how to do it for 25 years. Most people are not very persuasive. I'm sorry to make that huge generalization, but most people who work with can certainly benefit from learning more about how to be persuasive. And so, yeah, that is a field in which I work and where clients, who are mostly companies and professional partnerships, find that we can provide great value.
This is fantastic. And I'm sure all of our listeners would love to hear more about how they can be persuasive in their business life, or maybe even their personal life, frankly. But before we go into some of these core subjects, I'd really love to know, Ewan, because you've got a fascinating background yourself. You know, everything from, of course, doing your voluntary work and starting as a teacher and then being a stockbroker, you know, all these different types of pieces. How did you come to be where you are today? Because you studied at the incredible University of Cambridge and you seem to have kind of almost just swimmingly moved from one different accolade and subject to another. It's really interesting. So I'd love to learn about how you came to be where you are today, and also maybe a little bit about the young Ewan when he went through his kind of decision-making process along his career journey.
I'm happy to share that with you. I mean, you gave a great introduction to my background when you started the podcast. Yeah, it can look either as if I can't hold a job down for more than 10 minutes.
And I didn't mean it like that.
Yeah, I mean, I've never stuck anything for a particularly long time until now. Or it can look like there's some coherence, and actually I do believe there is some coherence. When I studied medicine, which I did both at Cambridge, as you said, I then went on to London University, went to St Thomas's Hospital. One of the things I liked to specialise in was psychology. And there I was learning how to be a psychologist in a medical sense. I didn't carry it through to being a career, but a lot of that knowledge has stuck. I then went off to Westminster School and taught that school, and it's a fantastic school full of some really bright kids and some really creative people as well. And I was able to put into practice for the first time coaching people, but in an educational environment where it was largely pupils. From there, I decided I wasn't very good as a teacher, and I frankly think I was lucky that my pupils in my class got through their A-levels with the result they got. So I would never have been a great teacher. I would have been an average teacher. So I thought I need to change tack. I had decided that I wanted to go and work in the City of London. A lot of my friends from university had gone there, and frankly, I was attracted by the money. So I went to work there, started on a much bigger salary than I had as a teacher, and had a very enjoyable 8 years working in the city. And as you said, stockbroker, but also corporate financier. And I did corporate broking as well. So lots of different little bits and pieces of my work there. And as a young man, I was enjoying being single in my 20s, earning probably much more than I was earning on merit. They were just very high salaries at the time, and having a great deal of fun. But as I came towards the end of my 20s, I met my girlfriend, now wife, who is Australian, who came over here for a holiday. We met and we decided to get married, and I thought at that time I should think about my life. So one of those young Ewan decisions was about the comparison between being married and being a banker, and finding the two largely incompatible, and deciding then to have a change of career. And I looked around at lots of different things like fund management, private equity, insurance, and management consulting. And I ended up getting into the job I'm in now by applying to an advert in the FT to become a management consultant. Interviewed for the job. I joined an American consulting firm, first of all. Didn't stay particularly long, only 2 years for them, working for them. I didn't enjoy working for them. And so I and 3 other people from that firm split off and set up the firm I now run and founded 25 years ago, which is Grant Pearson Brown. So as a young Ewan, I was going through a lot of changes of career. You tell people that now today, they don't believe you, kind of line. But it was true even then that you could move around quite a lot. There was a lot of mobility in jobs. And as you see now, I'm on my 4th career, hopefully one I'm stuck at and trying to become quite good at.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. But I think that's brilliant testament to your skills. And I think the fact that, you know, there's a lot of young people and a lot of young leaders that I see out there who aren't scared to move from role to role. And, you know, I think it's almost that sense of wanting to follow their passion. And clearly you're very passionate about the spoken word, and that really comes out when you're talking to audiences. But on the other hand, with my headhunting hat on, I speak with a lot of C-suite execs, and, you know, they have regrets that they wish they'd done something else, but they feel like they're too long in the tooth, or they've been in it for too much for a long time for them possibly to change. And I think, you know, it really is a good thing to actually encourage people that it's never too late to actually change your mind. You know, like you said, you know, you've changed tack, you know, 4 times, and each time you've taken some real lifelong learnings and lessons away from what you've done, finally culminating with running your own successful practice.
Yeah, absolutely. The funny thing about this is I'm sure I would have been terrible at this job if I'd started it straight out of university. My English teacher at school, when he discovered this is what I was doing, collapsed and laughed on the floor because he said I would never have been any good as doing anything with English.
Really? Oh,
yeah,
well, that's
yeah,
not...
I'm a scientist, and we bring that scientific approach to the work we do now. But it is the spoken word world, and it is a literary world. It's an English literature world and an English language world. And I was terrible. I did it at O-level and got pretty bad results and didn't try to do it for A-level. So I had a good laugh with my former English teacher about the whole thing. But I think what happens with people through life is they acquire experiences. And this sequence that I've gone through is perfect in the order in which it happened. If you'd shuffled that deck and put it in the other order, it just would have been a disaster.
Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting that your English teacher almost poo-pooed your ideas back then. And I'm sure, they're now thinking, oh goodness, well, clearly I was wrong. On this topic, are there any kind of early experiences that the young Ewan experienced, such as this, that really shaped where you are today or had a profound impact on what you're doing right now?
Oh gosh, yes. The list is enormous of such experiences. I'll try and pick out a couple of high ones. I remember when I was doing banking that I was once asked to do a pitch for a piece of business on behalf of my boss who'd gone ill the day before. And I got into the office that morning not expecting to do anything unusual. And I got this message with a PowerPoint deck thrust in my hand. Go off and pitch to this FTSE 100 board, which was made up of the chairman, CEO and CFO, and persuade them to hire us. And I was bricking it pretty much at that point. But then I looked through the slide deck and I saw that the slides that my boss had created were deeply negative about how the company was running itself. And I thought to myself, I've got to go into this room and explain to these three people who run a company, using the slide deck that isn't even mine, that they're not running their company very well. That was a really terrible experience for me. I went off and did it, and guess what? We didn't get the business.
Oh, goodness.
But I learned from that a lot. I learned that it's not, you shouldn't do that to anybody. It's not fair. I learned that when you are going to give a presentation, you've really got to prepare it. You've got to know the subject well, and you've got to believe in what you're saying. And I just didn't believe a word of it, frankly. I didn't think the company was being run that badly. My boss obviously did, and he put the slides together. So that was one very pivotal experience for me. Another one actually is before that. It was when my wedding speech, which I can confess on this podcast. My wife will eventually hear this, that it was one of the worst speeches I've ever given. Probably the worst. It was terrible. And again, there's a lesson to learn from it. I was one of those bankers at the time who thought, God's gift to public speaking, even though we didn't have very little do anything. Master of the universe literally was the environment I was working in. And so I prepared a speech for my wedding, which I didn't rehearse very much, and I didn't learn it. And I got to the place where we were getting married, which was my old college in Cambridge. And I stood up to give my speech, and my brain wiped. I completely lost everything that I was supposed to be saying to my lovely wife and my family and my closest friends, 70 or so of them. And I learned then the impact that nerves can have on you. You wouldn't think that was a particularly difficult environment, but actually it is, of course, the most difficult environment of all.
Of course.
Combine that with the fact that I hadn't properly prepared and I hadn't brought a script and some notes, I realized then I better do something about my terrible abilities as a public speaker. And so I went off and got some coaching whilst I was working for the bank.
Goodness, you're scaring me now because I've actually written a wedding speech and I'm giving it in a week's time.
Yeah.
I'm thinking perhaps I should. I'm thinking perhaps.
You've written it.
I have written it indeed. I might practice it to you off air after this podcast, Ewan.
That would be fine. That would be absolutely fine. No ums and ahs.
Yes. Well, do you know what? Your wife has still married you, so clearly there was a positive outcome from that, and you took away some fantastic learning. But I really do empathise with that. I can really relate to it as well, because I remember the first time I stood up to give a public speech. Well, I was 16 years old. I was doing my GCSEs, and I hadn't prepared either. Just like you, hadn't prepared. Brain went dead, and I burst into tears in front of everyone. And it was one of the most embarrassing, humiliating experiences of my school life. And after that, I had this kind of inner fear of public speaking, which frankly, like you say, you really need to be prepared. It's so important because you have one shot at the biscuit a lot of the time, especially if you're pitching and trying to persuade clients, especially if they're FTSE 100 companies.
Absolutely. What a sad thing to have to retell, but that kind of experience sits with people for decades. And we will often work with people who've had one bad experience like that, and we have to coach them around. It's not easy. I mean, I'm sure you're well past it, but there are people who just have an allergy to public speaking. I mean, there's the technical term for it, glossophobia, fear of public speaking, which can be, most people aren't born shy of speaking, but somehow through our educational system, we've become shy about the whole thing. And my colleagues and I often have to go in to see clients who really aren't very good at it. They don't enjoy it, yet they have to do it. And the more senior you become in a business, get to the C-suite level, it becomes a significant part of your job. And so we're often coaching people, we're starting to coach people when they get on the board of a company, because they then have to do a lot of speaking and they don't like it and they haven't done very much of it. So that can last a long, long time.
Absolutely. And it can be completely debilitating, can't it? It's, those nerves, sweaty palms and fear takes over. Have you seen instances where C-suite executives have been really terrified of public speaking? Because I guess from the outside looking in, you always almost presume that those who are within these FTSE Fortune large companies who are giving speeches must be doing it all day, every day. But I guess perhaps that's not the case.
To make sure we contextualize my answer properly, most people, by the time they've got to the C-suite, are pretty good at speaking. They're not brilliant at it, but they're pretty good at it. So yes is the answer. There are a few cases of people who have managed to get to the top ranks of business without being great speakers, and we will work with them, clearly. But most of them have had some sort of important input or coaching input before they get to the C-suite. I won't tell you the name of the individual, but there was one guy who's been chief executive of one of the big banks here. And I worked with him quite intensively in the year before he became CEO, because he knew perfectly well his job would involve a lot more, not just public speaking, but speaking to the board, to shareholders, to regulators, to analysts. And so there was an intensive period of time where I worked with him. And actually I stopped working with him about a week before he became CEO, because by then the job was done. So there can be people who need some quite intensive coaching in the last bit before becoming C-suite. Mostly, though, they're not terrified of public speaking by then, because, frankly, it's career limiting, that kind of problem. And they just often promoted to the top level because of it.
And moving on to a topic that you touched on very, very briefly earlier in our conversation on women trying to get promoted. Now, I know you've got a plethora of experience across the board with lots of different types of leaders. And I'm really interested to know, especially with your psychology background, some of the profound differences that you might see between women and between men executives, and also how, we as women or diverse individuals might be able to glean some knowledge that might help rise up the corporate ranks.
I don't think there are any profound differences between men and women in the way they communicate. Strange enough, I had a meeting with a woman very recently who is trying to become a C-suite member. It's a finance director, CFO. And she's recently been turned down. I think she was probably the better of the two candidates. So it's rather sad to be able to report that result to you. And she's what they describe herself as a strong woman, and she is. And so I don't think that the gender should make a difference or does make a difference. It should be your competence to do the job that makes the difference to whether or not you get promoted. However, we know perfectly well that the top level of business is dominated by white males, middle-aged, classically. And I don't think that's right. I think that is not good for the businesses, and it's not good for the people either. But for women to get promoted, it strikes me there are a couple of problems that they face that men don't face. And I'll give you an example or two without mentioning where these people are working. But I'm working in a number of organizations with women specifically to help them get promoted. And here am I, a white middle-aged male, doing it. So there's an odd contrast. But what they tend to suffer from is an inequality of treatment. an inequality treatment. A classic comment that I will hear made to a woman who has been turned down for promotion is that you're not ready yet. And I don't get that comment given to men when they're turned down. And it would seem that if there is a difference at the point of being promoted, it is between women who are supposed to have already achieved a certain level of competence and excellence. Whereas for men, it seems that the promoters are willing to take a risk and promoting is a promise rather than already present reality. The consequence of that is women are told, you're not ready yet, come back in a year or whatever it might be, yet the men get promoted. So there's still, despite the very strong drive in the world that I work in for equality and diversity to be improved, for example, by increasing the number of women at the very senior level, I do find that even the organizations that are trying to help that balance to be redressed aren't promoting women in order to address the balance. And there's one particular client, again, I want them to remain nameless, but they've got about 10% of their top team are female, so 90% male. They recently promoted 11% of the promotions were female. So they haven't really moved the dial.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's good to hear.
Well, it's good and it's terrible, frankly, that, okay, it's 11%, not 10, but that's a nudge. That's nothing significant. And you almost say, well, here's the big moral debate. Do you promote women by giving a bias in favor of women because they're women, or do you not give any bias, in which case what you really need is 50% of the applicants to be women, and then 50% of them should be successful, and you move the dial that way.
It's a really tough one.
There aren't enough applicants who are women.
I know, it's such a tough one. I mean, there still is. I believe there is 7 female CEOs in the FTSE 350, which is just absolutely shocking figures. And it's interesting that you say the feedback has been that women don't feel ready and there seems to be more risk taken on men. But that is exactly what I have seen as well as a headhunter. But then also as a woman saying this myself, women also don't want to feel they have got the job simply because of a bias towards their needing to be more women in the business. So it's a rather frustrating catch-22 exercise, and one which I really hope the future generations will be able to solve, because a lot of it is about the pipelining and the talent management. And it seems, really, if there is someone internally that is not ready, why was there not a number of people internally that could have been ready and that there could have been a diverse platform of individuals? But again, I think it's companies, I hope, will take more responsibility for really moving the dial and not just nudging it along, as you say.
Well, there is one client in particular where I have been asked to work with a particular level of seniority of women, and only women, to help them get promoted. Now, it's entirely to redress the balance you've just given, which is that the number of candidates wanting to apply for promotion isn't equal. It's not 50-50 yet. What they've asked me to do is to help to develop those female candidates for the jobs to the point where they are every bit as good as the men, and therefore there can be no discrimination on the basis of but if there are 25% of them applying for the senior jobs, 25% will get the senior jobs.
Well, it's really good to hear that you've been assigned that task, and I really hope that when we hopefully do another podcast again, that you can report really fantastic results. So
come back to me time, because that's what
I definitely will do. I'm absolutely fascinated by this. And, just to ask you another couple of quick questions, because I know that you are a very busy man and I'm keeping you on this podcast. But I wanted to ask just about the psychology piece, which I find so fascinating, having studied business and psychology A-level myself many years ago. I know that you have done an awful lot within this specific area, certainly around persuasion that you've mentioned. I wonder whether you could impart any glimmering pearls of wisdom onto myself and to our wonderful listeners, Ewan, that might be able to help in our day-to-day lives when it comes to persuasion and confidence, in fact.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I'll take those two slightly separately, if I may. Persuasion, first of all, we're still developing our thinking on persuasion, even though we've been advising on it for over a quarter of a century. And that's because the scientific research that's being done, and there's masses of it being done in persuasion, is evolving the answer to the question of how to be persuasive. But I'll give you a couple of nuggets from all of that work that's been done. I think the first nugget is one I shared with you in the words you may not have seen before when I did that workshop with you with the School for CEOs. Latin words, logos, ethos, pathos. These come from Aristotle, who 2,500 years ago, roughly, was running a business school in Athens called the Lyceum, where he taught men to be persuasive. Sad to report, women were not part of the business school. Logos, ethos, pathos stands, rough translations, logic, being logical to make a persuasive case. Ethos is ethical, and pathos, passion. Not direct translations, but they're good enough. Of those three, Aristotle proposed they were all equally important. What's interesting in the modern scientific research that's being done is more about the order in which they're important. And so the nugget I'll share with you is that in order to be persuasive, you first have to have earned the trust of the people who you're trying to persuade. And that's the ethical part. Are you believable? Are you credible? Can I trust you? Then the second part, oddly enough, is an emotional one. It's in the pathos area, is communicating on an emotional level. And again, it feeds back to trust. If you were to say something like, I'm really delighted to be here with you today, but you don't sound like you mean it, you're going to generate distrust rather than trust. If you say, I'm really pleased to be here, that's an emotional thing to say. And it needs to be said genuinely. So authenticity is a very big word in this area now. But there is a need to create on an emotional level, to include emotion in what you say, but to make sure it's authentic and genuine. Funny thing we do is we coach people to be authentic. You might say that's a daft thing to say, but we're often getting people to revert back to being themselves rather than trying to be someone else. This does seem to be a factor that affects women more than men, incidentally, just to throw it back to that. So
I can see why that might be. I can see why that might be because actually, and I've experienced this myself as well, spending a lot of time with the C-suite as, well, a relatively young Asian lady walking into kind of boardrooms, is that I felt for some time that I needed to kind of puff my chest out, speak louder, and be more ballsy in inverted commas. And I now realize this is not the case because, first of all, it's very exhausting pretending to be something that you're not. And, you know, second of all, people do see through it. And actually, there's nothing wrong with being you and being your real, true, authentic self, because actually you're going to gel with some people, you're going to bond with others more than other certain people. And actually, you know, that is most certainly the best way forward, or at least what I found. So that makes sense to me.
I would put it even further, Leila. There's nothing wrong with being yourself. I'd say it's absolutely important that you are yourself. It's a slightly more driven way of putting the point, but it's absolutely essential. If you're not yourself, as you've rightly said, we will all spot who you are. You're doing something else. You're acting. You're being phony. That builds distrust and so on. You just won't be persuasive. Nobody should be doing it. But I do find in my discussions with a lot of women that we're coaching, we find a lot of them do think they should behave differently. One word used recently was, I need to be more professional. And I said to her, but you are a professional. You don't need to prove to anybody that you are a professional. And she said, I didn't really mean professional. What I mean is I need to talk differently, sound differently, be more ballsy, whatever the words are. And I said to her, well, that's actually what I want to stop you doing, because that's going to be less persuasive than being true to yourself, to be genuine. And so it is about stopping people trying to change or changing by accident how they're communicating. The last part of the argument, sorry, just make sure is to make sure you're logical. If you've gained trust and you do communicate with some passion, with some conviction, that's great. But if you haven't got a logical case, it won't be persuasive. So the order is very important. Trust first, then likability and honesty and integrity, and then have a really good case to put. On to confidence. Well, confidence affects both genders. It affects young people and old people. It tends to affect young people most, the lack of confidence. And I'm going to give you just a couple of lines about confidence, which is, if you're going to communicate to anybody, make sure you first of all have got a good story to tell. So that means work on it, build it up. Don't try to do it on the back of an envelope 5 minutes away from the meeting. Spend some time figuring out what you're really trying to tell people and if you need to do a persuasive case, the evidence in support of that case. That's content building. So know you've got a great story to tell. The second piece of advice I'd give is rehearse, rehearse, rehearse until you know you can tell it well. It's not quite the same as learning it off by heart, but it is being very, very familiar with it so that you know beforehand that you can do it well. That's the second part, right? So the first part is having a great story to tell. The second bit is knowing you can tell it well. And the third part is being comfortable in yourself. And I don't mean, like to tell you to be confident. What I mean is to realize that you're going in there for a sensible, good purpose, that there is a point you're trying to get across, there's an aim or a purpose to the meeting, to the act of persuasion, and that you feel good about doing it rather than feel bad about doing it. So those would be my little nuggets on confidence.
Those are fantastic, fantastic tips for everyone. And I think that everyone who is listening can absolutely apply all of those. And last quick question that I have before I go into summarize some of those real kind of gems of learning that you've imparted upon us today, Ewan, is what does diversity and inclusion mean to you? Because I know that you're passionate about it and you're obviously helping a lot of executive women out there, which I think is just truly fantastic. But of course, the show is called Diverse and Inclusive Leaders. So to you, how would you articulate diversity and inclusion?
Okay. Well, first of all, I only answered earlier on about women and men. So I don't think of it just as female, male. Diversity and inclusion means to me, in the case of being promoted, that the best candidate gets the job, blind to everything else. The second point is that a good organization is made up of diverse people, people who think differently. I had a recent meeting with a woman who's run coaching who said her daughter is dyslexic. And it's very easy to see dyslexia as a disadvantage. But dyslexic people have huge advantages in very specific areas and think differently. And if you were to bring the best talent pool to work for business, then you need a diverse group of people who don't think the same way, but who largely all think differently about things. It can result in what you might call quite interesting conversations, differences of opinion, and maybe even raised tempers. But that's one aspect of diversity, which, to get away from the stereotype, not everybody's the same. One thing that worries me about recruitment at the moment is that organizations are recruiting in diverse talent pools, but for identikit people. And actually, they're therefore probably going to end up with less diversity of thinking and approach than they intend, even though they might have different genders and different colors of skin there.
Absolutely.
Inclusion means everybody. It means that everybody feels like an insider in the business. There's nobody as an outsider. One client I'm working with on a project is not about male, female, so much as LBGT and so on rights and differences of skin color, differences of background, differences of education. Everybody should feel included in that organization and bring them whole self to work and not feel that they've got to act to pretend to be some other type of person to fit in with some sort of club or stereotype, but bring the whole self to work. Then you get the best out of everybody.
Absolutely. That's so fantastic, Ewan, and some really valuable points raised. I couldn't agree with you more when it comes to your point on inclusion. And to summarize just very quickly for our listeners from today's session, I've certainly learned a huge amount from you, and I've just jotted down a couple of notes here. What I would say to anyone who is very kindly tuning in today, either on YouTube or through Apple or one of your favorite podcast apps, some of the pearls of wisdom that I have learned from you is that it's okay to change your career and it's okay to change your tact. Do something that you enjoy and do something that you're passionate about, because that way you really will thrive. Clearly, Ewan's made a huge success of himself doing lots of different things that he enjoys and has changed tact, at least 4 times. And so it's absolutely okay to change your mind. When it comes to confidence as well, do spend some time. If you're giving a presentation at work or you've got something important coming up, do make sure you spend time figuring out what it is that you want to convey. Make sure that you are comfortable with yourself, that you have an aim or a purpose to what it is that you're doing specifically. And finally, I really love the pieces about Aristotle. What wonderful words. And whether I can pronounce them or not is another matter, but I shall try. Logos, ethos, and pathos, which means, as a rough translation, logic, ethical, and passion. And I think those three pieces there by Aristotle are still very, very important today. And to be persuasive, as Ewan says, you must first have the trust of those you're trying to persuade, and also be able to communicate on that real emotional level with true authenticity, and to be as genuine as you can. Because if you're being yourself and you're bringing your true self to work, not only are you going to be happier, you're going to eventually be more confident in yourself, and I'm absolutely sure have a more successful career and also personal life. So on that note, I will thank you very, very much indeed, Ewan, for very kindly being with us today, just before the bank holiday weekend. And I will also say to our listeners, do make sure you check out Ewan. Check out Ewan Pearson. You can find him on LinkedIn. You can also visit his website, which is the Grant Pearson Brown Consulting Limited website. And what I will do for everyone is I'll put all of these onto the show notes at the end of today's show for you. So before we head off, Ewan, thank you ever so much. And
Pleasure.
I really hope that we can have a further chat, because I have lots of things that I want to ask you about, including reciting my wedding speech to you, which I'm sure I hope won't be too unenjoyable for you. So for now, thank you very much.
Okay, that's a pleasure. Thank you, Leila.
Thank you. My name is Leila McKenzie, and you've been listening to Diverse and Inclusive Leaders, the podcast show, with you every week, and also on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. You can also now find us on YouTube, www.dialglobal.org/podcasts, or you can visit www.leilamckenzie.com/podcast. And I'll put all the show notes in there for you, as well as all of Ewan's details, so you can find him and track him down and ask him more about the art of persuasion. Thanks so much, and see you next week. Thank you so much for watching the Diverse and Inclusive Leaders podcast. Please do feel free to hit the like button below, or if you'd like to receive future notifications, do ping the notification bell here at the side. If you're interested in the audio version only, you can find it on the following streaming platforms. Any extra info and descriptions will be in the links below. Look forward to seeing you soon.